where if that was focused on kind of re-engagement and mostly that post-18 stage, but with the interest on could it be used for prevention, that creates a very nice bridge to what Laura and I want to talk about today, which is very much on the prevention side of the agenda in the pre-16 stage. And rather than these sort of quite intensive programs, more about a suite of activities that schools can put in place, which might individually be relatively modest, but putting them together, you can create quite a holistic program. So let me bring up the slides, and hopefully we'll have plenty of time at the end for questions as well. So let me briefly introduce myself, and Laura will come in later on in the slides as well. So I'm Chris Percy, I'm a careers researcher, and I've been supporting the Careers and Enterprise Company with this piece of work. Laura is the head of policy and impact at the Careers and Enterprise Company. And to briefly explain what that organization is, it's an independent organization, but with a sort of a government-funded mandate to oversee and support careers provision in schools and colleges, secondary education across England. It does some delivery, but in the main, schools and colleges manage the delivery for their students. And what the CEC does is help provide networks of people to link it together, to support it, self-assessment tools, pockets of funding, lots of evaluation and research as well. Laura will talk a bit more about the broader CEC context in a moment. So the context for this work, in a way, much of the work that CEC does, and certainly for these slides today, is what happens after compulsory education finishes in England, which goes up to the age of 16. The year in which you turn 15, 16 is called the academic year 11 in England. And as of 2013, students finishing year 11 had to remain up until the following year in compulsory education or training, work-based training. In the other UK nations, they're able to leave after age 16 and do something else, although of course the vast majority stay on in education. What you could see in the slide on the screen is that, well, as far back as the data goes in this particular trend, and particularly since the policy was introduced in its current format to require participation after age 15, 16 in at least educational training, there's been very little change in that participation rate. It's gone up a little bit and then down a little bit, but broadly speaking, it's static, with about 6% of our 15 and 16-year-olds failing to sustain an educational training destination in the following year. And sustaining is sustaining for 6 months. So we looked at the destinations, the sustained destinations, these 6-month destinations, for 3 particular cohorts from 2016-17 through to 18-19. The reason we chose those, it may look a slight block in the middle of the screen, but we chose them very deliberately because that's the latest data that was available when this research started last year. So the 2019-20 destination results were not yet published. It takes about a year for the destinations to happen for a start, and then it takes another 6 months or so to clean the data and publish it. And prior to this period, the policy that we will be talking about wasn't implemented at sufficient scale. It did come in a little bit in the year prior, but only in a few hundred schools, not really enough to analyze. So this is all the cohorts that it was possible to analyze. So that's the context, this sort of stubborn post-16 participation rate. And the topic is there a link between that participation rate and the Gatsby benchmark achievement? And you've got the Gatsby benchmarks listed on the right-hand side of this page. It's 8 features of school or college provision for their young people. And each of these 8 is broken down into several sub-indicators. And there's an online tool by which schools and colleges can self-assess. And we turn that into a score from 0% to 100% on this. The Gatsby benchmarks were designed in 2014 by the Gatsby Foundation. That's the report here on the left-hand side, and they formally became a government policy in December 2017, but there had already been a year or two's effort, sort of voluntary effort, if you like, among the education system to adopt them and work to them. So that's the topic we're looking at. The particular data we've got to work with is observational data, so we'll be very envious of Serena and Donnelly's randomized trial later in the year. We are, on the other hand, we have a large sample, so there are some attractive things about this. We have the school level data, so this is school level rather than student level, which I will come back to towards the end. We have data on how does each school self-assess its careers provision quality on that 0 to 8 benchmarks, up to 100% score. We only look at the government funded schools, and we only look at those with enough year 11s that the data actually exists. That's fairly routine. And when we also have the destinations also published at a school level, and that is the percentage of those 16-year-olds who are still confirmed, known to be in a sustained education, employment, or training destination in March the following year, and our school year runs September to August. We end up with a sample of about 5,000 schools. There's roughly 4,000 schools. So when we got about roughly 2/3, between half and 2/3 of the schools in each year. We have that over 3 years. Now, the big challenge with any sort of analysis in the education sector is endogeneity. And what I mean by that is there are choices either at a school level or a teacher level or a student level to participate in the sorts of activities we want to evaluate. In this case, all those careers activities on the previous slide, these things like linking curriculum learning to careers, that's fairly universal at the student level, but still it's the teacher and the school that chooses how much of an effort to put into it. Experiences of workplaces, that can often have some agency at the student level as well. Personal guidance, that's typically a one-on-one interview with a trained careers advisor, lasting somewhere between 25 and 45 minutes. That's a deeply personal intervention. And whilst it's recommended that everyone has one, typically most schools deliver it to a subset or maybe a majority. So the challenge with the data is, how can we adjust for the fact that some students and some schools and some teachers will have chosen to deliver more of this activity? And that choice is likely related to the sorts of destinations that their students will typically have. I mean, to give one example, those schools in a more deprived context, a more economically deprived context, may have fewer opportunities for positive destinations, those bits that are to do with training in a work environment, and there may well be more structural barriers to overcome for young people. On the other hand, we often find that schools and teachers in those settings tend to particularly prioritize careers provision, subject, of course, to the local budgets and employer resources, which are often more stretched in those schools. So you've got this kind of complex push and pull of relationships that's very hard to disentangle. And absent a sort of evaluation-friendly national rollout, our pragmatic approach was to include as full a range of control variables as we can, and to accept that inflates some of the uncertainty in our analysis. It inflates the standard errors and model uncertainty. And you can see the control variables build up on the bottom right-hand side. I won't read it out, but it's a fairly strong set for school level data, at least in terms of the location, the structure, the grades the students are getting, and a measurement of school quality. So that's the analysis approach. Let's look at the results. So the headline result, and that's the one highlighted in the red box here, is the main model, including all of those control variables. So that's in the full report, you can see the build up layer by layer. It doesn't meaningfully change anything I'm saying to you now. So the one that's reported is with all of these in place. And the headline is a statistically significant reduction in the non-participation rate, the non-confirmed. We don't know that they're in an education, employment, or training route that they sustain until March the following year. And it's a 0.7 percentage point drop on something that starts at about 7%. So a pretty substantial bite gets taken out of that stubborn non-participation as associated with what would be full achievement. So we should clarify that in the sample, there are some schools with full benchmarks, 8 out of 8. There are some with 0. So we've got the full range, but as will be no surprise, the majority are kind of somewhere in the middle. The national average was around 2 or 3 when this program started 15, 16. It's now up to 4 or 5. So it's somewhere in the middle of that spectrum. But there are people with 0 and 8 still in the data. We have a few alternative specifications and robustness checks that you've got either in the full report, the links are at the end, or in the footnote. I won't talk through that now, but if there are questions on it, I'd be delighted to take them. So that's what's happening overall. And again, to emphasize, school level data. Now we can go a little bit deeper. We can look at the routes that young people are going into at a high level, the routes they are sustaining. And that gives us some indication. We know that overall it's improving, but what are the bits that are going up? What are the bits that are going down as part of that? And you can see these routes listed. And this is just for that main model, the one with the red box around it on the previous page. So we can see that the largest effects in terms of statistical significance are a decrease in unknown destinations. Schools that are working harder on their careers provision also work harder on tracing their students afterwards. It's a fairly modest effect in terms of percentage points, but it is highly significant. This isn't a surprise because one of the Gatsby benchmarks is to work on tracing your destination. So it kind of makes sense. The apprenticeships is also one of the stronger findings. And this is both in percentage points, but also in percentage terms relative to, we have a very low uptake of apprenticeships in the UK and England, in all the nations. And we look with great envy at Switzerland and Denmark and Germany. And every few years, there's this repeated policy discourse about how can apprenticeship rates be increased. And this appears to be one intervention that does incrementally support it. But any education system with a substantial apprenticeship route would look at this, and it is still very small for a post-16 route. There's also a more subtle and sort of borderline statistically significant, kind of a tentative finding. The numbers are meaningful, but there's a wide range of uncertainty around them, which is encouraging students into school sixth forms and perhaps fewer into further education colleges. And that ties into quite a live debate in England, which I can again talk more to if there's interest in the questions. So that's the route. Where, as I say, apprenticeships, the increase in that is of particular policy interest in England. One of the concerns about the low uptake of apprenticeships, one of the drivers for which there's quite substantial evidence, is that the route is negatively stereotyped. By young people, by their parents, by teachers. Nearly by definition, teachers enter the education workforce having gone through an education route rather than apprenticeship route. There is the occasional exception, but the vast majority. So teachers are typically not familiar with it. They may not be prejudiced against it, but a simple lack of awareness can feed into how these things are understood and transferred. So the fact that career-related learning about apprenticeships, meeting employers, there is a strong mechanism of change which underpins the statistical correlation that is shown on the screen. Okay, what about group? So there's one group that we break this down by, which is schools with a large proportion of economically disadvantaged students. So typically these are students whose parents are or have recently been on state welfare. So they might be claiming job support for being out of work. They may well be unemployed, or they may have health disadvantages. And the sample size is smaller, obviously, because we're looking at the top 25% most disadvantaged schools. The p-value is slightly weaker. It's a bit of a less consistent, a less statistically significant finding, but not in a way that is surprising or concerning because the sample size is reduced. What we do see, though, is a materially stronger relationship. And given the uncertainty in these numbers, when Laura and I talk about this internally and externally, we sort of describe it as about twice. I mean, technically, it's slightly over twice the strength, but if you frame the analysis slightly differently, it can jump up and down a little bit. So about twice. And so what that tells us, at least on this data set, by this type of analysis, career guidance of the type captured in the Gatsby benchmarks seems to be particularly powerful at improving the staying on rate in educational training for young people when their parents are on low incomes. It's not a silver bullet. There are still plenty of young people not being supported through, but there is nonetheless a meaningful improvement. I'll talk briefly about limitations, and then I want to hand over to Laura to talk a bit about the CEC context. So one limitation is, as I've mentioned before, this is cross-sectional data. We don't have a randomized trial to drive it. We've got good reasons, good analysis, good theory of change, good reason to believe that what we've just shown you, a significant component of that, it may well be an underestimate, a significant component of that should be causal. But the analytical method alone isn't enough to draw that conclusion. You need to combine it with testimony from young people, or there's no shortage of that, or indeed the theory of change. This is a good point to briefly mention student level analysis, because something else that Laura and I have been working on is a longitudinal study in England, a government funded sort of third party one called the Millennium Cohort Study, born roughly around 2000. And they overlap. Their time in secondary education overlaps with this Gatsby benchmark era that we've been analysing here. Tentative analysis, not yet published, but using similar sorts of control variables, student level data, we find a significantly stronger relationship when you look for exactly the same outcome, basically, NEET outcomes post-16, significantly stronger if you analyse it at the student level. And that gives us increased confidence that there is a true causal relationship here. It suggests that the relatively modest scale of what's been observed here, I mean, it's substantial in policy terms because it's so difficult to improve youth engagement rates, but still modest in terms of the bigger picture. It gives us some confidence that that's down-weighted by the nature of the analysis, the nature of that model uncertainty I described earlier on. But nonetheless, I will save that for a future Disrupted Futures conference. We have looked at lots of different specifications, but there's always more. And the results do tend to jump around a little bit. You'll see in the report, this isn't the most positive, but nor is it the most negative of the specifications. It's the one that we think captures the data best. You could do more on model precision. And there's something really subtle. Let me dwell on this briefly. There's something quite subtle about young people if they choose to go into employment with training after the age of 16, which would count as a positive destination from a policy perspective, or if they choose to move to a further education college, which we saw just before. Now, further education college, in brief, it starts at age 16. They're much larger than schools. So young people are moving to a new environment. Now, that may be excellent. It may be just what that young person needs. But by the very nature of doing something new and different, apprenticeship, work-based training, moving to an FE college, doing anything new brings with it some degree of risk, even if on balance, that risk is well worth taking. One thing that is happening in this analysis is we are effectively penalizing schools whose students go to those inherently higher risk destinations, even if that's the right thing for the young person. And that's something that we haven't attempted to adjust for. It's quite sort of statistically complex and politically controversial how you would adjust for that, but we definitely want to flag it up. And to make the segue to Laura, other outcomes beyond post-16 destinations are very, very high on our list for future work. Let me pass over now.
Thanks very much, Chris. And as usual, thank you for explaining everything so clearly. I'm always, I always learn something new from your analysis of this exciting and increasingly rich and at scale amount of data that we are able to draw insight from at the Careers and Enterprise Company. So this slide here is really about the broader context for us at the Careers and Enterprise Company, and really how we think about impact for young people. And what we've put up here on the screen today is just a very kind of high-level summary theory of change around how we consider we drive better outcomes for young people in terms of careers education. So please bear with me. This is simplified. It doesn't describe everything we do, but hopefully you'll see we're able to start to evidence a basic theory of change around how we drive outcomes for young people. So if I could take each column one at a time, and you'll see when we come to column 3, we've been able to use in a practical way the insights that Chris has generated from the data. So column 1, first of all, what do we do? What is our model? As Chris described, we work directly through schools and indeed colleges. There are actually about 5,000 of them in total in England. And we also join them up with networks, as Chris described. So you can see in the first column here, we have 90% of the schools and colleges in England in something called a careers hub, and that's where those networks happen. Those networks bring into contact with schools what we call cornerstone employers. So those are whole organisation, businesses, employers who engage at local level. And business volunteers, we call them enterprise advisors. So they get matched or paired with individual schools and colleges. The numbers you see here are at a point in time. You know, generally they're going up, but some of them sort of go up and down in a seasonal nature. But the coverage of careers hubs is something that we're looking to take to 100%. So 90%, you know, we're almost there. Secondly, we train careers leaders. This is a key leadership role within schools and colleges, and at this point in time we had about 2,700 trained. We also give them resources, digital tools, and we really kind of give that wraparound support to give them the ability to really kind of drive up performance against those Gatsby benchmarks. And then thirdly, you can see at the bottom of column 1 we have about over 85% of schools and colleges are reporting to us using, you know, against those Gatsby benchmarks that Chris went through, those 8 standards of great careers education. So column 1 is really saying that we're rolling out a system of support. Column 2 is about what that then enables the system to do in terms of performance. And that's where we talk about Gatsby benchmark performance. So that's how we measure performance. As Chris said, the schools and colleges, and particularly those in careers hubs, actually do relatively well compared with their peers. So they achieve 5.6 out of 8 compared with those that are not in careers hubs. Obviously, more and more will be in careers hubs over time. We can also, you'll see on our impact page, which is referenced at the bottom here, we can also track over time a difference among the upper quartile most disadvantaged, socioeconomically disadvantaged schools, and we can see that they both get more benchmarks and improve faster over time, which is really positive. And then thirdly, at the bottom here, our average benchmarks across the whole system have gone from 1.8 to 4.9 in 5 years. There's a big debate around, can you get to 8? Can everyone get to 8? You know, it's self-assessment. We think that's really important, you know, enabling schools to give a kind of realistic and honest self-appraisal. We've also got programs in place to track quality around that self-assessment, which is really exciting. So the final column, which I think is where today's research is so exciting for us, is that, you know, we're starting to establish that link between those benchmarks and outcomes in terms of young people who are remaining, you know, in training, education and the workforce. So the way we've started in this model is we see for each benchmark that's been met, a 1.9, almost 2% reduction in the proportion of young people who are NEET, which is not in education, employment or training. Then that is for the most disadvantaged schools. So that's those schools where, as Chris said, you get kind of double the impact. There are other outcomes that we're tracking. So, for example, we have a really exciting tool called the Future Skills Questionnaire. You know, Serena Donnelly, you know, what you talked about in terms of, you know, social and economic, emotional well-being, you know, all those kind of essential skills, as we call them. You know, we're tracking that as well. So we have data from schools and colleges that indicates over the course of their secondary education, young people are generally becoming more career ready and more aware of things like apprenticeships and technical routes. And the third area where we're building out our kind of expertise and support to the sector is around measuring how careers education helps employers develop outcomes for themselves, such as their future workforce. So we've got a really exciting initiative around employer standards, which will get more and more data from employers about really that business case for working with schools and colleges and helping young people get better outcomes from careers education. So hopefully that gives you a sense of, you know, we do one thing, it drives up, in the second column, it drives up provision, closes gaps, and it develops these outcomes. So I'll hand back to Chris. As I said, you know, Chris, your research has really helped us kind of establish that link. You know, we think it's pretty compelling. You know, we think it's at scale across the system. So it's really significant and exciting for us. And we're really interested to hear about questions today. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. It's just our summary slide. So if there are any questions, we'd love to hear them.